Hello, Game Boys and Game Girls. I'm the Game Boy Guru, and welcome to the first edition of a new series that I'm calling Game Boy Oddities, where I'll be looking at a number of different strange and weird things that have happened with the Game Boy hardware, software, and peripherals over the years. In this first edition, we'll be looking at some strange audio and visual artifacts across different hardware within the game Pit Fighter.
Pit Fighter is a 1990 arcade game developed and published by Atari Games, the arcade division that was left after Atari Incorporated split into two parts, Atari Games and Atari Corporation. Atari had been producing arcade titles since it first debuted Pong in 1972, and many of their titles had been somewhat groundbreaking. Being ahead of their time didn't always result in excellent gameplay for each innovation or original idea, however. Still, one had to give credit to Atari for trying, and they certainly scored quite a few major hits over the course of their lifespan. One such innovation that Atari Games jumped into, before two other publishers made it cool to do so, was the head-to-head fighting game genre. As history has recorded, the competitive fighting game genre had a few titles trickle out during the 1980s with some success. Notable entries included Karate Champ from 1984, Konami's Yair Kung Fu from 1985, and of course the original Street Fighter game from Capcom, which debuted in 1987. Before Street Fighter II in 1991 and Mortal Kombat in 1992 effectively kicked off the fighting game craze of the early 90s, Atari Games took a stab, no pun intended, at making a competitive fighter of their own with a couple innovations. First, the game used actors whose motions and fighting moves were filmed and digitized to become game graphics. While Pit Fighter wasn't the first fighting game to utilize this technology, it is by far the more well-known early example. Also, because it was an arena fighter with a perspective similar to that of many scrolling beat-em-up games, it allowed for a more open experience and up to 3 players simultaneously on the same cabinet. This multiplayer innovation would, of course, be utilized to great effect in later games, such as the Power Stone series for the Sega Dreamcast, and, of course, in Nintendo's Smash Bros. Series of competitive fighting games. The idea behind Pit Fighter is simple. Choose a fighter and beat up your opponent as quickly and efficiently as possible, taking as little damage as you can and racking up stacks of cash with each successful victory. You can achieve these victories by punching, kicking, or jumping and attacking your enemies. There are holds and throws, a handful of moves to execute, and objects in the arena such as knives, boxes, sticks, and more that you can use to punish your enemies with. If you get too close to the edge of the screen, you may get stabbed by an audience member or get shoved back into the arena if you hang out there too long. It's a pretty simple formula that worked well enough upon the game's release. When Pit Fighter was seen as a hit, naturally Atari Games turned its attention to licensing the game for home console and computer releases. This resulted in a number of mediocre ports of the game, as well as a few downright lousy conversions for hardware that could never hope to replicate the experience. The Game Boy, as one might expect, was home to one of the more lackluster and limited ports. However, it's not the port itself that is the subject of this video, but a couple oddities within that port that manifest on certain iterations of Game Boy hardware. The game was designed to work on the original Game Boy DMG-01 model, which was the only available Game Boy hardware at the time, so it's likely the development team behind the Game Boy port didn't realize the kinds of issues the game would experience when used on later hardware revisions. Pit Fighter on the Game Boy is notable for its inclusion of a handful of medium-quality voice samples made possible by the Game Boy's third sound channel, otherwise known as the Wave Channel. While not the only Game Boy title to do so, it likely has the best-sounding voices among any title released up to that point. The portable rendition's developer, THQ, also tried to replicate the graphical style of the game by utilizing sprites that mirrored the arcade game's digitized characters, but in a much reduced 4-shade monochrome style. This differed from most games on the handheld, which were usually drawn in a much more cartoon and anime-inspired style, with outlines for each character rather than in a more realistic manner, such as this. This gave the Game Boy port a relatively distinctive visual style, as compared to other Game Boy titles released up to that point. Other games, released later in the system's life cycle, would later adopt that style, such as the Donkey Kong Land series, but in 1992, it was a fairly unique idea on the monochrome handheld. The specific oddities in question are the video, when played on the Super Game Boy adapter, released 2 years after Pit Fighter's release on the handheld, and some strange audio issues that plagued the game when played on Game Boy Advance hardware, as well as on the Game Boy Player add-on for Nintendo's GameCube console. On the Super Game Boy, certain palettes almost make some characters disappear among the background, depending on how much they overlap. This is because of the lack of an outline around the characters, as mentioned before. It doesn't affect every palette choice available, but it's notable nonetheless. The audio issue, however, seems to be across multiple iterations of the Game Boy Advance hardware, such as the GBA, GBA SP, and the Game Boy Player all use the same base hardware, with minor variations. Because of some anomaly or difference in the way the GBA hardware processes audio, compared to the original Game Boy line, it causes the audio to be distorted, in that, along with the game's music, sound effects, and voices, you will also hear a loud ringing noise, sounding almost like a chip sound approximation of a coach's whistle. The degree to which the whistle sound overlaps among the voice samples and sound effects seems to vary intermittently, but when playing on GBA hardware, it appears to be a near constant presence. Let's have a look at the game running on an original Game Boy DMG, the Super Game Boy, a GBA SP, and the Game Boy Player to note the differences.
So here you can see when you watch the attract mode, you can hear the voices, you can hear the music, and you can hear the various sounds of punches and kicks and attacks taking place. You can also see, if you can pick it up from the video, the characters, although you can see, depending on your perspective, it's hard to see on camera of course, but you can see that because the characters don't have defined outlines like they do in many more cartoon-style games, that the character sprites tend to get lost a bit in the background because of the limitation of the Game Boy's 4 monochromatic color configuration. But when you're actually looking at the screen, and you've got it pulled up close to you, it's still reasonably easy to tell what's going on and kind of see what's happening on screen. And also, as you can hear, the voice samples are actually not that bad, surprisingly, for a game that's kind of a low-grade conversion of an arcade game with digitized actors as sprites. Decent animation for its time because of that, and a lot of voice samples. It actually doesn't translate that terribly in terms of the animation and the voice samples. Alright, and here's Pit Fighter on the Super Game Boy. And as you can see, compared to looking at it on the original Game Boy DMG screen, this is a little bit cleaner, as are pretty much all Game Boy games. But if you pay close attention to the shading within the characters, you can definitely see that they look much more well defined here than on the original Game Boy screen. But if you'll notice, as you watch the fight, based on the 4 shades that you have with the fighters, you'll see that sometimes one of the fighters will get lost in the background a little bit, especially if the fighter gets pushed over to one side or the other, and their head or other portion of their body that matches the sort of solid color of the floor outside the ring actually is overlapped on that. Then they're not defined because they have no outline that specifically denotes that they're a character rather than just a background element. Unlike most Game Boy games that take on a more cartoony feel or have much more well-defined sprites, you can see that because of the way these were developed and because they chose not to give those characters more defined outlines, that often portions of the character sprites do blend in with the background and kind of get lost. It's especially apparent when you start to look at some of the other palettes available on the Game Boy Color. Here you can see, as you got a lighter background, things really blend in. The same for a standard black and white. Well, not the same for a standard black and white. Actually, this probably resembles closer to what you would see on the Game Boy Pocket, with its more black and white aesthetic versus the 4 shades of green. And this is closer to what you see on the actual Game Boy. But I've played around with some of the other palettes here, and you can see that some of these are pretty goofy, the way that the sprites can get lost in the background. As you can see there, the opponent, some of the shading on the opponent has that same hue as the background. It certainly makes it interesting when you look at this, and you can see all the different colors and, you know, the different shades that they're used, and see, depending on the color combinations you choose, how quickly they get lost in the background. Like the enemy fighter, his pants being the same color as the background there, if he's standing up along the edge, he starts to disappear. It's an interesting phenomenon that you probably don't see in very many Game Boy games during the original Game Boy era, because most of them were designed specifically for that screen or were adapted from other 8-bit games or earlier arcade titles that had very defined sprites, outlines around all the sprites because of the design of the Game Boy and the limited color palette, and everything was well defined. But with this game being ported over with the digitized sprites intact, but just in a much reduced format, there was no consideration for that with the design team. And as a result, as you've seen here, these things tend to get lost in the background. However, if you listen to the sound, you can hear that all the sound is present on the Super Game Boy, as it is with the DMG and the Game Boy Pocket. You get the music, you get the voice samples, and the punches and kicks sounding normal, if you will. You'll see in a moment where that won't be the case on newer Game Boy related hardware, however. As you can see from the footage taken with the Super Game Boy, there's some really odd video stuff happening there, with character sprites blending into the background and kind of getting lost depending on where they're at on screen and which character you happen to be playing, or sometimes enemy sprites can also get lost in the background. It's a strange phenomenon that, as I mentioned in the Super Game Boy portion, is probably only apparent in a handful of Game Boy games that have a similar design aesthetic, where there aren't defined lines around character sprites that easily differentiate those sprites from background graphics and other foreground objects. Now we're going to take a look at what happens when you play this on the Game Boy Advance and also the Game Boy Player on the GameCube. Now let's take a look and a listen at what Pit Fighter is like on the Game Boy Advance. Right away, you can see the default palette looks fine, and the fighters aren't getting lost in the background. But if you listen to the sound, you'll hear there's kind of a weird ringing. Some of the voices come through, some of the punch and kick sounds come through, but some of it presents as that strange ringing sound. I'm not sure why it does this, but there must have been something in the way the original Game Boy hardware operated, the original Game Boy sound hardware anyway, and a difference in how that is either output or possibly emulated with the Game Boy Advance. I don't know whether it has anything to do with stereo or not. The Game Boy Advance does not have a built-in stereo speaker. Of course, neither did the original Game Boy, but it had stereo output via headphones. And the Game Boy Advance SP, at least, has no audio output unless you buy an adapter to plug in headphones. Now, when I first played this on the Game Boy Advance SP, I thought it was a very strange phenomenon, something that I'd never seen with any other game thus far. And I've owned and played a number of Game Boy games, and the Advance SP is generally my favorite way to play Game Boy games on portable hardware, in terms of using the original cartridges and playing them on official hardware. But it's just very bizarre, all the ringing, and it makes it very difficult to play. Of course, it's not exactly a great game, and it's not one I would recommend anybody run out and grab so they can go play it. But certainly if you were a fan of the original growing up, or you wanted to revisit it, because of the sound issues, I would not recommend doing so via the Game Boy Advance SP. And now here's Pit Fighter as seen on the Game Boy Player via the GameCube. As seen and heard, obviously. You can see it uses the same base palette as the Game Boy Advance SP did. But as you can hear, you still get that near constant ringing when there are sound effects present. Pretty interesting and also pretty annoying. Needless to say, I may need to do some additional research to determine what the differences are between the original Game Boy DMG sound hardware and what the process is that's being used within the Game Boy Advance SP and the GameCube Game Boy player. My assumption is that this same sound phenomenon happens on the original model of the Game Boy Advance, though I don't have one to compare with, so I could not say for sure. And there you have it, folks. Audio and video problems within the game Pit Fighter when played on non-original Game Boy hardware. To sum up, and in my view, I believe that the video problem is strictly due to the fact that there are no outlines around the sprites, and because of the limitation of the 4 shades of gray or green on the original Game Boy hardware, you're just dealing with overlapping colors and not a clear enough definition between the different shades in the way that the game was converted. With the audio issues, however, it's very curious, and I've played a significant number of Game Boy games on the Game Boy Advance SP because that is my preferred way to play original cartridges when I'm on the go or just in general. When I want to pull out the cartridge and actually use it with real hardware, that's my preferred way to play, even over the Super Game Boy and Game Boy Player most of the time, just because of the portability aspect, and even around the house, I can do that while someone else watches TV or just kind of go off into my own little corner and do my thing. And with the audio issues, I've not heard that with any other game that I've played via the Game Boy Advance SP or, in fact, the Game Boy Player. So, as I said, it's very curious, and I will need to do some additional research in order to try and determine what the hardware differences are and whether or not the Game Boy Advance is actually emulating the experience or whether it's just a difference in the sound hardware and the way it's interpreting the code. Regardless, it's an interesting artifact from that time period, and of course, since the game was designed at an early enough time where something like the Super Game Boy or the Game Boy Advance were many, many years off, no one could have predicted what kind of experience one might have with a second or third generation of hardware that many years down the line. I want to thank you all for watching this first edition of Game Boy Oddities. I've got a couple of ideas of other videos I want to do for this series, and we'll be doing some research and some different things to try and come up with interesting content for everyone. So thank you for watching, as always, and game on.